For 21 seasons, a quiet workshop in Massachusetts became one of the most unexpectedly influential spaces in American television history. It wasn't loud. It didn't rely on spectacle. It didn't chase trends or manufacture drama. It simply showed a man, his tools, and a patient commitment to doing things properly. That man was Norm Abram, the master carpenter behind the new Yankee Workshop, a program that would go on to outlive most of the television era it was born into. And yet, when it ended in 2009, the reaction wasn't just surprise. It was disbelief, because nothing about it felt like it should ever stop. To understand why its ending hit so hard, you have to understand what the show really was. And more importantly, what it refused to be. It began not as a media experiment chasing ratings, but as a quiet extension of craftsmanship already proven elsewhere. Norm Abram had already become a familiar face through this old house where he worked alongside builders and tradespeople restoring homes with careful precision. But even there, something stood out. His calm, methodical approach made complex woodworking feel strangely approachable. That observation didn't go unnoticed by producer Russell Moorish, a man known for building television around authenticity rather than performance. Moorish didn't see a television personality in Norm. He saw a craftsman who didn't need to pretend to be anything else. So he built him a space, a real workshop, fully equipped, tucked behind a Massachusetts farmhouse, and gave him a simple idea: build things, explain them clearly, and never rush the process. What followed was deceptively simple television. Each episode of the new Yankee Workshop followed a single project: a shaker table, a blanket chest, a Windsor chair, sometimes something more ambitious. Norm would begin by introducing the piece, often referencing its historical roots. Then he would break it down: material selection, joinery, structure, purpose. And then he would build it, from start to finish, slowly, precisely, without shortcuts. There were no gimmicks to hold attention, no manufactured tension, no celebrity guests arriving mid-episode to shake things up. Just a man working through wood with quiet confidence, explaining each decision as if he were teaching someone standing right beside him. And somehow that was enough. By the early 1990s, the show had become a fixture in American households. Saturday mornings weren't reserved only for cartoons or loud entertainment anymore. For many viewers, they became something calmer, something grounding. Watching Norm Abram became less about learning woodworking and more about spending time in a space where patience still mattered. There is something almost meditative about it. The sound of saws cutting through hardwood, the careful alignment of joints, the steady rhythm of sanding and measuring. Even his reminders about safety, always the same, always gentle, became part of the ritual. Always wear your safety glasses. It wasn't just instruction. It was a philosophy. Over time, the workshop itself became as recognizable as any television set in America. Not because it was flashy, but because it wasn't. It felt real. It felt lived in. It felt like a place where work actually happened, and that authenticity carried weight far beyond television ratings. Woodworking clubs reported increased membership. Tool manufacturers noticed spikes in sales after episodes aired. Community colleges saw renewed interest in carpentry courses. Teachers used episodes as teaching material. Entire generations of viewers began associating craftsmanship with patience rather than speed. Without ever claiming to be influential, Norm Abram had become exactly that. But while viewers saw calm precision, what they didn't see was the machinery required to make that simplicity possible. Behind every 22-minute episode was a process that stretched far beyond what appeared on screen. Each project required weeks of preparation. Materials had to be sourced with exact specifications. Not just any oak or maple would do. Grain direction mattered. Moisture content mattered. Even the physical dimensions of each board had to be accounted for before a single cut was made. Then came the design of the episode itself. Producers and crew had to decide how to translate a full woodworking process into something that could be followed in real time. Which steps would be shown in full? Which could be condensed without losing clarity? How do you maintain authenticity while still respecting the limits of broadcast time? And at the center of it all, Norm still had to do the work. Not simulate it, not demonstrate it. Actually do it. Every cut viewers saw was a real cut. Every joint was real. Every mistake had to be corrected in real time. There were no backup versions waiting off camera. No digital corrections. No second takes disguised as first attempts. It was craftsmanship under observation, but not altered by it. That commitment to real work is what gave the show its credibility. People who understood woodworking could immediately recognize the difference. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was staged. And for viewers who had never touched a chisel in their lives, it still felt honest in a way they couldn't quite explain. But honesty, as it turns out, has a cost. For years, Norm Abram maintained an intense schedule. During production periods, he wasn't just filming the new Yankee Workshop. He was also contributing to this old house, moving between two demanding roles that each required full creative and physical commitment. One role asked him to collaborate, the other required him to lead entirely. On the workshop set, he was everything at once: designer, builder, instructor, and host. There was no separation between performance and labor. The job was the labor, and it wasn't occasional. It was sustained over decades. Hours turned into years. Years turned into seasons. And seasons accumulated into a kind of physical reality that doesn't show up on camera, but settles into the body nonetheless. The workshop floor itself didn't help. Concrete, unforgiving, unyielding. Standing on it for hours at a time, sometimes 8, sometimes 12 became routine, repeated movements compounded. Lifting lumber, guiding saws, bending over workbenches, adjusting clamps, sanding surfaces until they were perfectly smooth. It looked calm. It looked controlled. But repetition has a way of leaving its mark. By the time the show entered its later years, those marks had begun to surface in subtle ways. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just gradually enough that they could be ignored until they couldn't. Joint strain, back fatigue, chronic foot pain. The kinds of conditions that don't announce themselves loudly, but persist quietly in the background of daily work. And still, nothing changed on screen. That was part of the discipline. Norm never broke the illusion of ease. Even when the work became physically demanding, the presentation remained steady. The viewer experience was untouched, but behind that steadiness, decisions were beginning to form. There comes a point in any long career where the question shifts. It's no longer about whether you can continue. It becomes whether you should. And for Norm Abram, that question became unavoidable. By 2009, he was nearing 60. The physical demands that had once been manageable were now accumulating in ways that could no longer be dismissed as temporary discomfort. Conversations began quietly with Russell Moorish and production teams at WGBH Boston, the station behind the show. But these weren't dramatic conversations. There was no conflict, no collapse, no urgency-driven crisis. Instead, there was something rarer in television: mutual recognition of limits. The show wasn't failing. It wasn't declining in popularity. It wasn't being pushed out by changing trends or audience loss. It was still respected, still watched, still valued, which made the decision more personal than professional. Because the real question wasn't whether the show worked. It clearly did. The question was what it was asking from the person at its center. And eventually, the answer became clear enough that it didn't need justification. The decision to end the new Yankee Workshop came from Norm Abram himself, not from a network, not from external pressure, not from behind-the-scenes conflict, just a recognition that some chapters reach their natural conclusion. There were rumors later, as there always are when something ends quietly. People speculated about disagreements or declining interest or hidden tensions. But none of that held up. Those closest to the production consistently pointed to the same reality. The show ended because its creator decided it had fulfilled its purpose. Norm himself addressed it with the same tone he carried throughout his career: direct, unembellished, without unnecessary drama. It had been a good run, a meaningful one, and it was time to step away. That was all. No grand farewell. No final spectacle designed for television sentimentality. No emotional send-off engineered for ratings. Just closure. And yet, when the news reached viewers, the reaction was anything but quiet. For many, it felt like the end of something far larger than a television program. Message boards filled with reactions. Woodworking communities discussed it not as entertainment news, but as the loss of a familiar presence. Some spoke about how they had grown up watching it with family. Others described how it had introduced them to a craft they would later build careers around. What stood out most wasn't anger. It was respect. People understood, even if they hadn't been aware of the full physical toll, that something real had been given over those decades. And real things eventually require rest. The emotional response revealed something important. The show hadn't just taught skills. It had shaped habits of attention. It had taught people to slow down, to observe carefully, to value precision over speed. In a media environment increasingly driven by noise, that kind of influence is difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. The legacy of the new Yankee Workshop wasn't just in the projects built on screen. It was in the projects built off-screen by viewers who took what they learned and applied it to their own lives. Thousands of pieces of furniture exist today because someone once watched Abram explain how to make them. Some of those pieces have been passed down through families. Others still sit in workshops, unfinished but started with confidence that didn't exist before. And then, years after the final episode aired, something unexpected happened. The entire series became accessible again through digital platforms. New viewers discovered it without nostalgia, without context, without memory, and still responded to it in much the same way. They described it as calming, focused, refreshing in its simplicity. In an era defined by acceleration, it offered something rare, permission to slow down. Norm's influence, it turned out, hadn't faded. It had simply changed audiences. As for Norm himself, stepping away from the workshop didn't mean stepping away from work entirely. He continued contributing to this old house, but in a reduced capacity that allowed him to remain connected without carrying the full physical burden he once did. For the first time in decades, he also had space for personal work, projects that had been waiting for attention, finishing details in his own home, small repairs, creative woodworking done without schedules or production demands. Work for the sake of work itself. He also participated in documentary projects and occasional educational appearances, always maintaining the same tone that defined his career: clarity over performance, substance over spectacle. Eventually, after more than 4 decades of television work, he fully retired from regular broadcasting. And even then, the workshop remained, still standing, still intact, a space where tools still existed not as props, but as instruments of real craft. From time to time, Norm returns to it, not to film, not to perform, but simply to build, quietly, naturally, without needing an audience. Because in the end, that's what defined the entire story. Not fame, not television success, not longevity in a competitive industry, but the simple act of continuing to build something real for as long as it made sense to do so. And when it didn't anymore, having the clarity to stop. That is why the ending of the new Yankee Workshop didn't feel like a loss in the traditional sense. It felt like completion, a finished piece of work, set down carefully, with nothing left unfinished in its intention. And perhaps that's the quiet reason it still resonates today. Because in a world that rarely knows when to stop, there is something deeply human about a story that simply says, "This was enough.